Please hear me all right? Okay. Well, a warm welcome to the first talk of our autumn season here. And today I'm going to be talking about the latter-day Pre-Raphaelite painter, John Rodham Spencer Stanhope. Give you a little bit of background to his life and the variety of his work. It's a type of painting that we've touched on before in some of my lectures on Victorian aestheticism and particularly on Edward Burne-Jones, and some of the characters in this talk will be familiar with you, those of you who have attended some of my other art lectures. But this is a newly put together talk this evening. It's the first time I've done it. I did a smaller version of it at Marlborough College Summer School when I was fortunate enough to be working there last month and was able to give a little talk on some of the paintings in the chapel. And I'm indebted to Nick, who's come along this evening for some of the historical information in this particular talk. Let's move on. The Painter of Dreams. His pictures somewhat resemble his own life in its aloofness. They're abstract visions created in the far depths of a cloistered mind. His gracious fingers seem to voicelessly act as in the most pensive dreams. Angels move voicelessly among trees that murmur not, for winds are at rest, the bird's song mute, and the waters pass softly as falling snow. So said William de Morgan at the memorial exhibition in 1909. And I was fortunate enough, as I've said, to give a talk in Marlborough College Chapel this summer on 12 of the most significant paintings, and indeed one of the most wonderful cycles of Pre-Raphaelite art that can be seen in Britain. But of course, being in the college chapel, it isn't often open to the public, and therefore it was a rare treat to be able to spend time with these great works of art. But we're going to follow this man's life as it was led, and he intersects with many well-known characters in Victorian times and Victorian art. So where do we start? Well, Spencer Stanhope came from a wealthy family. They resided, the family come from South Yorkshire, and Cannon Hall was in fact his father's home, and they made a considerable amount of money from the burgeoning Industrial Revolution, particularly coal mining. And the Cannon Hall is near Barnsley, near Sheffield in South Yorkshire. And it can still be visited today, and it is in fact one of the best places to visit if you're interested in the art of Spencer Stanhope, and indeed the family portraits are there, and much to do with Spencer Stanhope's boyhood and life. It is a fine property, and I'm very indebted to Cannon Hall for some of the photographs that I've used in today's talk. He was colloquially known as Roddy. But his elder brother was the one who actually inherited from his father in 1873, leaving John Rodham Spencer Stanhope to pursue his skill as a painter and as an artist. And in fact, although he briefly tried a commission into the army, it didn't last very long, and he followed his dream to be an artist, much to the disapproval of senior family members. You might know that the Spencer Stanhope family were significant also in the 18th century, and his forebears, his grandfather, was part of the Society of Dilettanti, as recorded here in the Joshua Reynolds painting and the engraving after the painting itself. And this is reflected, I quote this really because it reflects in Roddy Stanhope's own work, in that he had a great fascination with the classical world, and it continued. In fact, as his work progressed through his 40s, 50s and 60s, he became more and more enthralled to the classical world. And this brought him in line with artists like Poynter and Leighton, as well as Burne-Jones. And so the mythological subjects almost began to take precedence in his work. But he starts off in quite a different vein, really. So that's his older brother, Walter Spencer Stanhope, and he was the one who actually lived at Cannon Hall. And we know too that all the family took an interest in Greek art and the antiquities of Athens, particularly the James Stewart was one of the most significant antiquarians of the time, and the Stanhopes played a part in that particular work and in collecting classical art. And remember, at the beginning of the 19th century, the Parthenon marbles come to the British Museum, and this also plays a big part in the formation of some of the background and some of the interests of the Spencer Stanhope family. On a personal level, Roddy was not someone who enjoyed good health. He had very bad asthma, and this dictates very much in his life why he finally settles in Italy, not just because of the love of art, but because the air and the atmosphere was much more conducive to his very sensitive lungs. You can imagine living in Sheffield in mid-Victorian times, or in Barnsley in Victorian times, or indeed even in London, was not exactly the place to be if you had asthmatic conditions, as so many Victorians did. And we know quite a bit about this from what we learn of Spencer Stanhope, and in some of his letters, he even delays finishing paintings because of his asthma. And yet he lives a full, long life. So he goes initially. He's as a young man. He goes to rugby school, and there's a picture of rugby as he would have known it. And then following rugby, he goes to Christ Church, Oxford, and that is a very significant move for him. Oxford was to play a part in his life, an important part in his life and his artistic development as well. I don't have information whether when he was actually at Oxford, whether he saw the first paintings in the print shop, but the Coombe collection, but he certainly saw them by the mid 1850s through Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and he comes into contact with William Morris and Burne-Jones in the mid 1850s. He was also, being a Christ Church scholar, he also knows Lewis Carroll as well. And that photograph in the top left-hand corner was taken by Lewis Carroll probably in 1859, 1860. Lewis Carroll is, of course, a very significant photographer at the time, and we see photography play a part in John Rodham Spencer Stanhope's paintings to some extent. But he initially seeks tuition from one of the most eminent artists of Victorian Britain, and that is G.F. Watts. And in 1853, after graduation, he travels in Italy with Watts under the egress of Baron Holland, who has property in Italy. And he actually follows Watts, and he gets tutorial advice from G.F. Watts. Watts didn't normally take on assistants or tutors, but it seems that he was prepared in Spencer Stanhope's case to create an exception. Watts was a tremendously refined artist, as we know. I've given talks on him, and he worked with an eye to the classical tradition. He certainly was not Pre-Raphaelite, though. That's often a mistake. And then when coming back from Italy in 1853, early 1854, they have sort of soiree at Cope's Castle, Holland House, which no longer fully exists in Holland Park. There's a picture of it there. And the Hollands entertain a group of artists. They already patrons to G.F. Watts, and at this meeting, Dante Gabriel Rossetti is known to the Hollands as well, and it is there at Holland House that Spencer Stanhope makes the acquaintance of Dante Gabriel Rossetti, the leading Pre-Raphaelite painter. He also was very much influenced in that time with Watts's social realist paintings. Some of these I'm going to be talking about next month when we look at Victorian social realism, particularly his paintings of the Irish famine and also the poor in London, and particularly the painting Under a Dry Arch. Impinged upon the conscience of Spencer Stanhope, a life so different from his own, which was well-heeled and upper class. So the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, as I'm sure most of you know, was formed in 1858. And the three principal characters are John Everett Millais, the young genius who painted his tremendous paintings, Isabella and Ophelia, in those early years of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and he seemingly could do no wrong as regards this new style in painting. There was William Holman Hunt, of course, the famous painter of The Light of the World and The Howling Shepherd, and of course Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who was a radical painter who did not exhibit as widely as the other Pre-Raphaelites, and nor did he try his luck at the Royal Academy after a fierce criticism, but he was certainly a formidable intellectual force within the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. The aim of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood initially was to revive British art and to make it as dynamic and powerful as late medieval or early Renaissance work, and to have this effect of change within British art, which had become quite stultified. And one of its great critics was in fact, of course, William Michael Rossetti, who was also, as like his brother, a supreme intellectual force in this new movement, a young men's movement, which really did change the course of Victorian art, and of course made an enormous impression on Spencer Stanhope as a young man. So it was in the summer of 1857 that the Pre-Raphaelites were invited by John Ruskin to decorate the Oxford Union, now which is now the library, but this was the Oxford Union debating hall in Victorian times. Recently, the architect Benjamin Woodward, also of the University Museum. And here is an engraving of what it looked like as the Pre-Raphaelites were decorating this new Gothic-style hall. And many of us who know Oxford or who live in Oxford have visited these murals and will know that the project, although a laudable project, had many difficulties about it, in that the plaster on the walls was not really correctly prepared. Neither was Rossetti great at fresco, nor is the British climate conducive to fresco. And these frescoes, such as they are on Arthurian legend, are in extremely poor and very fragile state. There have been many attempts to, in fact, restore them. And when I saw them 2 or 3 years ago, they're certainly legible, but they are by no means how they would have appeared in 1857-58. So during that summer and autumn, Spencer Stanhope worked alongside Dante Gabriel Rossetti, Arthur Hughes, Valentine Prinsep, J.H. Poland, William Morris, and Edward Burne-Jones, and Alexander Munro, the sculptor. And of course, they worked hard, and it was fulfilling some of Ruskin's desire to see Pre-Raphaelite painting play a part in a larger scale and be part of an architectural sequence as well, which of course the smaller easel paintings could not be. So certainly they were very well designed paintings, and we also have, of course, the wonderful watercolors for them by Rossetti and his compadres in this project. Ruskin, who was 10 years older than the artists, found the whole situation very difficult to manage, and he records it as such. And Rossetti, though, notes it as a very jolly work in itself, but really no one. Really, one is mad to do such things. And of course, there are many tales about the Pre-Raphaelite hijinks, and just like any young men, it was a time of quite a lot of merriment, and obviously great evenings of social evenings together following a hard day at the murals. And but an interesting project, and even if it is somewhat a failure, it is part of the Pre-Raphaelite story. Certainly, the original Pre-Raphaelites Brotherhood, as it being formed in 1848, had somewhat broken up by this stage, with Hunt gone to the Holy Land, and Millais up in Scotland following the annulment of Ruskin's marriage, and spending his time on a new, less tight Pre-Raphaelite paintings up in Perth in Scotland. So, and at this time too, we have the beginnings of the Oxford University Museum of Natural History, and it was Spencer Stanhope's sister married Richard St John Trywhitt of Mary Magdalene Church, who was also a very famous, apart from being a priest, he was also a very competent amateur artist. And the other day I was able to go into the director's office at the University Museum, and there are some wonderful Ruskin-inspired paintings of glaciers. And unfortunately, they pile up a load of filing cabinets against the wall and all that. But anyway, I'm working on getting some good photographs of some of these hidden Pre-Raphaelite masterpieces. And these were also painted fresco, like those in the Oxford Union, but they've survived in a much better state. Sadly, his sister died in 1859, the year of Rodham's own marriage to Elizabeth King. And they too have a daughter, and she is Marjorie, or known as Mary, and that was a significant year in her life. As for his sister, she is buried at Brookwood Cemetery in near Woking in Surrey. So it was, Oxford played a big part in this early part of obviously the Pre-Raphaelites, as they make progress into this new art that really is transforming the whole art world of England at the time. And at Chatham Place in Blackfriars, Spencer Stanhope shares a studio or an apartment above Rossetti's studio at Chatham Place near Blackfriars Bridge. And it was at this studio that Spencer Stanhope painted perhaps his best known easel painting, and that is one called Thoughts of the Past, painted in 1858. And it echoes William Hogarth's The Harlot's Progress. And it depicts a young woman who has fallen, rather like in the story in the Hogarth series of prints, who has fallen into prostitution. And so it is one of these Pre-Raphaelite works that is a complex work that deals with the subject of the fallen woman. And of course, being a Pre-Raphaelite painting in this meticulous style, not only does it demonstrate Spencer Stanhope's wonderful skill as an artist, but it also represents the intricate symbolism that he adopted from William Holman Hunt and from Millais at the time. And in fact, we can see in the background, in the wharf in the background, we can see men loading corn onto a boat, which they would have been able to observe from the window of their studio. But it also indicates that this young woman has come from the country to the town and has fallen on hard times and has entered a world of prostitution and vice. Similar to William Holman Hunt's painting of 5 years before, The Awakening Conscience, where a kept woman comes to this realization that her life has become trapped, just as the bird is being trapped by the cat beneath the table. Her life is similar to this. And so it is with Thoughts of the Past. It is this moment of reverie where she has come to a revelation that her life has come to this difficult point. Interestingly enough, the model for Thoughts of the Past is none other than Fanny Cornforth, who was intimately involved with Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and indeed has quite a checkered life herself. This is a painting. I've got a little detail from Thoughts of the Past in the top left-hand corner, and you can see it is painted in that very early Pre-Raphaelite style, very, very tightly painted with small stable brushes, and every single hair is painted with great veracity. And there's another painting by Rossetti of the same woman, Fair Rosamond, painted in 1861. And there's a drawing too by Boyce of Fanny Cornforth and Rossetti at Chatham Place, a little ink drawing, and that would be in a similar view that Spencer Stanhope would have had out of his window. And it was at this period too that Rossetti was painting his unfinished masterpiece, Found. And so obviously the artists were discussing these type of social realist subjects at the time. And these are very different from the later works that we shall be looking at. And here is the drawing for Thoughts of the Past, which is at the Tate Britain. And I'm pleased to show you this sepia drawing to show already what a fine artist Spencer Stanhope was. Of course, it echoes other non-Pre-Raphaelite paintings of the period that very much deal with the same subject, particularly Augustus Egg's trilogy of Past and Present, of a woman who falls into adultery and then is thrown out of her marital home and ends up destitute underneath a dry arch. And then, of course, we have G.F. Watts's own painting from 1850, inspired by Thomas Hood's The Bridge of Sighs, Found Drowned. And so these paintings occupied the mind of many, many artists during this period. And I shall be talking a little bit about this in my talk in October. But we can see how perhaps Augustus Egg's painting sticks closer to a sort of Pre-Raphaelite version, but his tutor, G.F. Watts, also was very much taken with these subjects as well. And so there is a sort of an amalgam really in Spencer Stanhope's work. And certainly he takes on this, I call him a latter-day Pre-Raphaelite. He is just a little bit in this next phase of Pre-Raphaelitism as it deals more with landscape and social complexity and subjects such as this one here. And also, he was constantly plagued by asthma. This house on the hill, as it's known in Barnsley, was another place which gave him some relief from the choking smoke of the wharf at Chatham Place at Blackfriars. And he stayed some time at this house. It probably has been altered a little bit from Stanhope's time, but this is one of the places where it was thought there would be more fresh air on the hills, slightly better. But the idea of sickness and sort of asthmatic conditions plays its part in a lot of Victorian illustration and painting, particularly things like The Youngest Child's Death by his Oxford Union companion Arthur Hughes deals with this subject. In fact, Spencer Stanhope is quite close to Arthur Hughes as well, and certainly they share a lot of their ideas together at this time. And particularly if you look at this next painting by Spencer Stanhope at 1860, and this is called Robins of Modern Times. And as you can see, it echoes almost a mirror image of Arthur Hughes's painting, The Woodman's Child from 1860. Whereas Arthur Hughes' painting is really purely a narrative painting, beautifully painted with the harebells and the flora and fauna of the woodland, and indeed even a robin, just as the same as in the Spencer Stanhope painting. There is no suggestion of anything more complex than a child sleeping whilst her parents work in the forest behind. However, Spencer Stanhope's painting is much more radical and much more troubling when we examine it, because it does concern the loss of virginity of this young girl. And it is indicated in Pre-Raphaelite manner by the fact that the field behind the child, or the young, probably no older than 12 or 13, lies on the ground, and behind it the field is ploughed on the hill, indicating that. And then we have the fallen garland. We also have the apples, reminiscent of the Garden of Eden and man's original sin. And so it is a very hard-hitting painting in many ways, and a troublesome one at that. So it's an early painting, and a Pre-Raphaelite work that deals with this sort of moral complexity that is favoured by people like Ford Madox Brown, and certainly we see that in his work and a number of the other more socially conscious Pre-Raphaelite painters. and it's still painted in this meticulous style. But Spencer Stanhope was to abandon this type of easel painting for something more ambitious as he moved on as an artist. At this time, too, being of reasonable means, the commission from Philip Webb, just after he had completed the Morris House at the Red House at Bexley Heath, that he commissions Benfleet Hall, or named Sandroyd, which is in fact a house in Cobham in Surrey, and that's Webb's second house, and that was the Spencer Stanhope house as well. Probably not so well known, and yet that was an important place. And some of these Burne-Jones tiles were also created for Sandroyd, and so by this period, Spencer Stanhope knew the people in the firm, Philip Webb, and certainly Burne-Jones and Morris as well, and who he both knew from the murals, and he continued his association with them, though not joining the firm himself. Possibly he was approached, but he didn't join the firm. But he does turn his attention to the local church at Cannon Hall, which is Cawthorne Church. And if you look at the pulpit here, you can see some paintings on the pulpit. And also in this church, there are Evelyn de Morgan angel paintings as well. Spencer Stanhope's painting Christ in His Glory is a good example of his, as you can see, it's much more angular and in fact more conscious of design than, shall we say, Robins of Modern Times or Thoughts of the Past. It is definitely with an architectural setting in mind, and indeed he carries this through now in his work. And there's also a much more flattened picture plane than in the early Pre-Raphaelite works. So he is certainly developing as an artist, but I want you to notice that he has an exquisite colour sense even at this stage in his artistic career. And he moves on. You can see he's already adopting a sort of Rossetti, Burne-Jones type of style. And these paintings of angels with panpipes and bagpipes are a very good example of his work from the early 1860s. Quite a decorative format, and decoration is a big part of Spencer Stanhope's work, as is the language of flowers and an appreciation of medieval art, particularly also as he travels to Italy, and it gives him much more inspiration, looking at many of the frescoes in Florence particularly, frescoes by Masaccio and also work by Piero della Francesca play a big influence on his art. And indeed, he is one of the few Pre-Raphaelites from Burne-Jones who is directly influenced by Italian art, and not through the medium of engravings, but through travel itself, and actually to examine the Florentine works, which play a big part in his own work. And he also designs this one. This is not very well preserved. This has almost got an Oxford Union mural kind of treatment to it. This one, The Ascendancy of Christ, painted about 10 years after Robins of Modern Times, is on the east wall at the another church here just near Barnsley. And I've just photographed the outside of that church. I hope to get a better photograph of this one actually when I go up to South Yorkshire, and hopefully I can get some better photographs and better angles of it. But as you can see, it certainly has suffered in some ways, being painted in fresco. He was quite adventurous in his technical approach. Indeed, he loved the frescoes that he had seen in Florence, but as a technique, it's very hard to translate this fresco technique into a British setting just because of our climate, and particularly up in South Yorkshire, you're not going to get an undamped wall, and you're not going to get things drying off in quite the way they do in Florence or Arezzo. Now, tragedy hits the Spencer Stanhope family. He was beginning to spend more and more time in Florence, partly for his health and partly for the art, staying at the Villa Nuti, which he later bought. And he also spends time at the British Institute in Florence, which was a hub for many of artists abroad, including William Holman Hunt. And sadly, at the age of 7, their daughter Marjorie Spencer Stanhope dies, and this tragedy is absolutely pivotal on his psychology and his life from this point on. And we see it echoed in many different ways in the type of the myths that he engages with and the stories from the Bible that he engages with too. It is a great loss in his life. And it was at this time that the Spencer Stanhopes actually consoled William Holman Hunt and looked after Holman Hunt's son Cyril after the death of Fanny Holman Hunt in Italy at this time. And so at this time, Spencer Stanhope was pretty close to William Holman Hunt, who I've talked about in some of these talks before. And they spend time together, and indeed, it's an important relationship for Spencer Stanhope. There is Holman Hunt in the middle with his son Cyril, and Cyril goes on to become celebrated in a very famous painting of Fitzwilliam by William Holman Hunt. Holman Hunt also paints a number of watercolours in Fiesole near to the Villa Nuti, and certainly other artists go through the British Institute in Florence. It's noted that Spencer Stanhope wasn't able to get an introduction to see Frederick Leighton at this time, although his art was moving in that direction too. This idea of processions in paintings, which was very much a Leighton idea, which was to appear in his own work, and Leighton is obviously quite an influence upon Spencer Stanhope's later work. This is the Villa Nuti in Florence, where he painted the reredos on the right here for the English Protestant church in Florence. And it really became, this particular villa became a real hub for English artists, particularly Burne-Jones and Walter Crane, and Bodley stayed in this particular villa, and the relationship with Bodley is an important one too. Spencer Stanhope, by 1880, actually settled in Florence, and his paintings tended to go backwards and forwards between Italy and England, and often retouchings and gilding took place in England, and some of the more the painterly work took place in the studio here in Florence itself. So he is a truly Pre-Raphaelite painter in one sense, that he really spends time among the original Pre-Raphaelites of Florence. There's a painting by Holman Hunt from this time, which is in the Victoria and Albert Museum of the Ponte Vecchio. And of course, it is painted at night. And Hunt at this time was very interested in watercolour. And we know that likewise, Spencer Stanhope took a great interest in tempera and watercolour as well. And indeed, actually became very proficient in painting in tempera. And so he's quite experimental in his techniques. And as I say, he's moving away from classic easel painting and painting on canvas on a small scale. He designed his daughter's tomb, which is in the Protestant cemetery in Florence. He also spent time designing aspects of St. Mark's English Church in Florence, and that's an example of the interior there. And some of his work will be found there. Some of his decorative work will be found in the Protestant church in Florence, and indeed in the graveyard there, which also has a number of other English artists. And of course, Holman Hunt's first wife, Fanny Holman Hunt, is buried there. And that's the inscription designed to Psalm 23 by Spencer Stanhope on the tomb. Edward Burne-Jones said, "I mean by a picture, a beautiful romantic dream is something that never was, never will be, in a light better than any light that can ever shone, in a land no one can define or remember, only desire." And that is the case with two. It could be a watchword for Spencer Stanhope's work, because we notice a significant change. By 1870, his work definitely mimics much of Burne-Jones's own work as well. And we notice that his figures, which are very Burne-Jones-like as well, occupy a very flattened, almost decorative quality, and there's little in the way of depth in Spencer Stanhope's paintings, and that's quite deliberate. But unlike Burne-Jones's, they are polychromatic in colour, and we know that he did have problems with colour blindness as well, and there is some sort of idea that in fact others had to mix some of his paints because of his red-green colour blindness. But he certainly had an exquisite sense of colour, and his paintings do have this dreamy, otherworldly quality. And they've moved a long way from Robins of modern times now. They are dealing with a classical world, and as such, they are very beautiful. And I suppose it is rather like Burne-Jones's own thoughts on art and development of his own work. So the more materialistic science becomes, the more angels I shall paint. Their wings are my protest in favour of the immortality of the soul. And one could say the same in Spencer Stanhope's work as well, that it is this reaction. And these are examples, very much, both these paintings influenced by Sandro Botticelli, of course, the great Florentine painter, and in particular, his painting Primavera, which is in the Uffizi, certainly as a seminal influence upon Spencer Stanhope's work, and indeed Evelyn de Morgan's work as well. He was influenced by the poet Ovid, and from a Metamorphosis, the story of Cephalus and Procris, who he accidentally kills his wife with the spear, and that is the picture up on the left-hand corner, 1872. Again, it's a reflection upon mortality, which is a dominant theme within Spencer Stanhope's art of his maturity in his later work. And very often there is this underlying, even though the colours are beautiful, there's this underlying sense of fate which occurs within his work. Love and the Maiden is actually an interesting painting because painted in 1877, it isn't a defined subject, but it does exhibit many of the characteristics that we've come to like in Spencer Stanhope's work. That is this strong link with the natural world, particularly the language of flowers, and certainly very much an awareness of the work of Sandro Botticelli, and Masaccio, and probably Andrea Mantegna can be seen in these works. And we certainly, his art now has solidified to this sort of classical Pre-Raphaelite style, quite far removed from his work in Chatham Place. And it is Marlborough College Chapel where really I first encountered this major series by Spencer Stanhope. I'm grateful to Nick for this frontispiece from his book, and the original picture of the original chapel at Marlborough, which of course was replaced. But we can see flanking the walls of the chapel were the 12 paintings that really make for one of the most interesting cycles of Pre-Raphaelite paintings in the country, and that is the old chapel. Now here's the Bodley and Garner chapel on the right. There gives you an example of how the chapel looks this day, and the paintings are absolutely splendid. Wonderful colour. There is George Frederick Bodley. Blore was the original architect of the original chapel from 1846 to 48. The chapel was completely rebuilt and enlarged and reconsecrated in 1886. And that's taken from the floor from the lectern there. And you can see the Spencer Stanhope paintings on the walls. And as you are looking towards the Reredos, on the left-hand side, we have the Old Testament paintings, 6 from the Old Testament, and on the right we have 6 from the New. And the theme of the paintings is the ministration of angels. So here we are. These are the subjects that occupy the paintings, and these were inspired by a sermon that was preached on a Founders' Day in 1864, I understand. The subjects are as follows. Number 1 is the expulsion from Eden. Number 2 is Abraham entertaining the angels. Lot rescued from Sodom. Hagar in the wilderness. The binding of Isaac. And then the 3 holy children from Daniel. And then on mirroring the other side, we have the Annunciation, Deo Gloria in Excelsis, the temptation of our Lord, the agony in the garden, the sepulchre, and then the vision of the New Jerusalem. And all of them, because the chapel is dedicated to St. Michael and all angels, it's all about angelic intervention in human affairs. And of course, this mirrors very much of the work of Burne-Jones too, and it's something that preoccupied a number of Pre-Raphaelite and artists of the 1870s at this time. and indeed is a bulwark against the sort of realist school of Hercoma and Fildes at this time. It's almost looking back at a pre-industrial age, and something that celebrates beauty and other virtues. Now, this on the right here is the first version of the Marlborough painting of the expulsion from Eden. It was rejected by the college because it was thought too risque, in that Eve's breast is exposed, and that would probably raise the pulse of so many of the schoolboys. So it had to be it had to be reworked and completely reworked and make it an entirely different painting. But I want you to notice that there was also quite strong decorative quality to these particular paintings, which exist in a number of forms. And of course, even though this one was not eventually installed at Marlborough, the various versions, of course, were highly saleable and quite acceptable to the Grosvenor Gallery in London. He obviously based it upon Masaccio's expulsion from Eden. And if we look also, it's very interesting. In this cycle of paintings, they feature 250 individual flowers, 120 herbs and trees and fruit, and many microscopically observed flowers and within all of the paintings. And there's this wonderful book by Hume called Familiar Wildflowers, produced at the same time, and I'm trying to work on a link between the two, but certainly like the early Pre-Raphaelites, it was the language of flowers which was very important in these paintings. So that in Victorian times, of course, every flower has a meaning. For instance, as you see in this little painting on the right, the violet's message represents modesty and fidelity. And so you'll see different flowers representing different things in the paintings of the Marlborough paintings themselves. And we can see it also mirrors the art of the Middle Ages too, particularly Cranach's Adam and Eve as well. We can see that the fruits of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, of course, an important part of that. And you can see that in Spencer Stanhope's paintings for this particular series. He did paint one rather less chaste Eve here in 1877. This is the same period as he's working on the Marlborough paintings, and this one can be, I believe, found in Manchester City Art Gallery. And of course, his friend G.F. Otts was also painting Eve at this time in his Eve Tempted, a famous painting which you can see in the Watts Gallery in Compton. And there's Spencer Stanhope's painting Abraham Entertaining Angels. And you can see his thorough knowledge of Italian art as well. From Arezzo, he's looking at the Piero della Francesca's Constantine's Dream. As you can see, Abraham's tent is very similar to that of Piero della Francesca's tent. And also the tent also represents the womb of Sarah, who would bear the promised son. But of course, we know it goes through another stage before that. He has a son with the slave girl Hagar, and that is also recorded in these particular paintings. So this is Abraham Entertaining the Angels. And in the bottom right-hand corner, we have Spencer Stanhope's painting of Lot rescued from Sodom. And we can see in the background the city of Sodom and Gomorrah in flames and billowing smoke. And of course, the instruction not to look back. Unfortunately, Lot's wife did look back and was turned into a pillar of salt, so we understand. But Lot's daughters, who again play a part in the history of salvation in many ways, due to incidents following the leaving Sodom. But it's also an interesting because Holman Hunt was also quite interested in the idea of Sodom and Gomorrah, because he painted in his Scapegoat the hills of Moab in the background, and it is the desolation of the Dead Sea and echoing the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah, which is hinted at in the painting of the Scapegoat in both versions. And so this is something that preoccupied the Victorian mind. This is Dean Frederick Farrar, who preached the sermon on the ministration of angels on Founders Day in 1864, and that is thought to be the catalyst for this particular series of very fine Pre-Raphaelite paintings. This is the painting of Hagar in the wilderness, and there you can see she's been driven out of Abraham's household by Sarah, even though Sarah had been the one to encourage Abraham to sleep with Hagar. And there they are in desperation in the desert, and then the angel comes to Hagar and the stream of water opens up. And of course, then there is a whole history, and where Ishmael becomes an archer, and there is a whole history of the Arab peoples which look back to Ishmael as their sort of father of their people. And indeed, other artists at the time were obsessed with this subject, particularly Corot, who is Corot is an artist actually that Lord Leighton quite favoured as well. He had a series of Corot paintings at Leighton House. So this is a rather fine painting, Hagar in the Wilderness, and this is a much better photograph than I actually got when I was at the chapel, because they're rather dark. The lights in the chapel aren't good enough to really see them in this detail, but you can see it's a fine piece of work. The background rocks would rather resemble Madonna of the Rocks by Leonardo da Vinci as well. And this one here is an interesting one. This is the three holy children, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from from Daniel, from the prophecy there. And this is the figures walking in put in the fiery furnace by Nebuchadnezzar, and are being sheltered here by the angel. And it again echoes Piero de Francesca's Madonna della Misericordia from Arezzo, and also one could say also rather echoes one of the kilns that of William de Morgan that Spencer Stanhope would have been familiar with. So we can see here that there are lots of influences here. So here they are in the fiery furnace, but being unharmed. You might notice the little raised areas within the painting, and that's quite interesting. That is also a technique that he developed for these frescoes. And this temptation of our Lord also is interesting. You see the little devil in the rocks on the left. That absolutely mirrors Botticelli's The Mystic Nativity, which you can see in the National Gallery in London. And you can see the little devilish figures. Of course, this was painted at the time of the great Dominican friar Savonarola and the bonfire of the vanities. And certainly Spencer Stanhope was aware of that, and the Mystic Nativity was painted as a reaction to the troubles in Italy at the time, and the troubles with the Medici family. And again, this painting, The Temptation of Our Lord, was also painted in a period of great change in Victorian England too. And here we have Temptation of Our Lord, and Jesus being ministered to by angels following being tempted by the devil, and we can see the devil in the corner of the painting there. And then the final painting of the series is the Vision of the New Jerusalem. Again, it shows a great awareness of Italian art, particularly if you go to Urbino and the Ducal Palace in Urbino, you'll find this wonderful painting of the ideal city. And certainly Spencer Stanhope was aware of these paintings both from Florence and around the marches of Italy of the ideal city. Of course, it's something that has obsessed artists and architects since time immemorial. And there is the vision of the New Jerusalem coming down from heaven, and St. John on the Isle of Patmos being shown the vision of the New Jerusalem, and the sun rising on the new age. And that is the concluding painting of this particular series. But it's a fine series, and I can show you the other paintings sometime if you're interested in them. Again, for a technical point of view, if you're an artist, you'd be interested to know that he used a technique called pastiglia, which is to actually do raised areas on each of these paintings. They're quite large paintings, so to vary the surface, he actually built up with a sort of gesso type of plaster raised areas. He also painted alla prima, like many of the Pre-Raphaelites, that is painting into wet flake white or gessoed background to create the brighter colours. He used glazing and gilding, and he often had the things gilded in London. Much religious art was gilded in the Victorian age too. And later on in his life, in 1901, he becomes one of the founders of the Society of Painters in Tempera. And Burne-Jones pays this great compliment to Stanhope, said that his colour was beyond any the finest in Europe, an extraordinary turn of landscape he had too, quite individual. So that's high praise from Burne-Jones. He also painted a number of nudes as well, and certainly his nudes too were very reminiscent of Botticelli's *The Birth of Venus*. And in 1868, Leighton was the first major Victorian artist to show at the Royal Academy a full-length nude, and his Venus disrobing for the bath is an example of this new fascination with the classical world, and also the introduction of the nude into Victorian art. Which hadn't really been seen since William Etty's paintings of the 1840s. And certainly they're of a very different nature to these new type of nudes, which almost sort of indicate the coming of Art Nouveau. And one can certainly see that in Spencer Stanhope's painting of Flora there from 1885, an enormous decorative quality, a sort of sensual quality too, but perhaps something of a coyness that we don't get in Watts's paintings or Leighton's paintings of the nude. Certainly there is a lot of decoration in the background of them. Venus Rising from the Sea, painted in 1870 before the chapel paintings. You know, you can see all these lovely little dolphins in the background, and there's a highly decorative, and again we have the sort of Leonardo-esque type rocks in the background. Again, all influenced by the poetry of Ovid. And he also designed this too, the knowledge strangling ignorance. And you can see how his work translates into bas relief and the pastiglia technique. And again, like many artists, he tried his skills on the myth of Perseus and Andromeda. Andromeda tied to the rocks, and of course we think of Leighton's famous paintings of Andromeda and Perseus, and then we think of the Perseus theories by Burne-Jones at Southampton City Art Gallery. And so, of course, he was very much in that vein. It was a very common subject in Victorian art and in international art as well. There are many artists on the continent painting Perseus and Andromeda, and I can think of many great examples in the Victorian world of this particular subject. Okay, so here we come to the later paintings of Stanhope. Look at this one, Orpheus and Eurydice on the banks of the River Styx. And here we can see that again echoes Orpheus and Eurydice by G.F. Watts. And again, it is this the paintings about loss, which dominate his later work, or his reflection upon life and what lies beyond this world. And so the figures within it look to artists like Michelangelo, particularly the lower portions of the Last Judgment, where you have the ferryman, and certainly the rocks again are very much reminiscent of Leonardo. By this stage, his niece Evelyn de Morgan is becoming quite a very, very competent artist and working in a very similar vein, and we can see a great deal of correspondence between these two particular artists, and they influencing one another and play a significant part together. But there certainly is this preoccupation with death and the afterlife that starts to occur within his work as from the 1870s. He also, Morris is also an influence upon his work, and this is The Gentle Music of a Bygone Day from Earthly Paradise by William Morris, written in 1868. And this is a great example of the great William Morris's work translated into a painting such as this. And as you can see, he's completely abandoned the realistic Pre-Raphaelite backgrounds of the wharf at Blackfriars. It's now an Italian landscape that is highly composed, and lots of perspective anomalies, and really very much a work that takes, well, the figurative aspects of it take place in very near, close to the picture plane, close to the surface, and there's not much recession or aerial perspective in work such as this. And here's these very late paintings by Spencer Stanhope give you an idea of his preoccupations in later life, particularly Ezekiel and the Valley of Dry Bones, looking at whether these obviously talking about resurrection and can these dry bones live? And of course, the vision of Ezekiel is that the dry bones join together and become alive and resurrected. And there is the prophet Ezekiel. And then also this classical subject, the waters of Lethe, where the people are in all kinds of infirmity of later life, and they enter the waters, and suddenly their bodies and spirits are revived. And in the Elysian fields in the background, they are seen dancing and once again made youthful and new again. And this is a subject that occupied many a Victorian artist, particularly Walter Crane's The Bridge of Life. We can see a similarity with that. And also the idea of the ferrymen of crossing the river to a new world. And so, of course, we see these themes harking back to the Marlborough Chapel too, with the vision of the New Jerusalem. And here we have a reflection upon his own daughter's life. Had she lived to the age of 17, he hoped she would have looked like this. And this is Charon and Psyche, and there we are, the ferryman, and there is an imaginary version of his daughter had she lived. And again, it is this reflection upon life beyond death and life in the underworld. And you can see how he's echoing this painting here of someone receiving the host, the painting by Goya. And again, there are a lot of these references within his highly sophisticated work. Spencer Stanhope is a very erudite artist, and one who connects very much with the history of art as well, all throughout his work. So, and that is his niece, Evelyn de Morgan, who plays a big part in the later part of his life. There's her portrait of Spencer Stanhope in old age. He's buried at the Allori Cemetery, for Protestant cemetery in Florence, but he's also commemorated at his local church at Cawthorne near Cannon Hall. And his memorial exhibition took place at the Carfax Gallery in 1909. And it was curated by the De Morgans, and it was a very successful exhibition. But his work, of course, fell, like so many Victorian artists, into sort of just general disinterest and criticism of it being too unconnected with the real life and the modern world. And of course, it is only in recent times that his paintings once again have become highly sought after and enormously interesting to Victorian art historians. And I'd like to thank all these people. I've tried where possible to acknowledge all the photographic information, and I've tried to take photographs myself. I'm going to try and upgrade these as I am able over the year. I mean, if I give the talk again, I should have better photographs of some of the paintings. I hope you found this an interesting artist to look at, and I'm happy to take a few questions now. Stop the share.